Tonight's webinar is about ensuring that you have a resume that makes you competitive in today's marketplace. So we're excited to have you all with us today. Before we begin, I want to remind you all that the Hiatt Career Center and the Brandeis Alumni Association have partnered to bring you a wide range of career services that are free of charge for life. It's part of our ongoing commitment to alumni, no matter when you graduated, where you live, or what your career path has been. And this webinar is part of that commitment. You can find out much more about our resources for alumni by visiting the Hiatt webpage under the alumni link. So by now you should see our first slide. And I think this makes a really good point. A lot can happen in 10 seconds. A well-trained athlete can run 100 meters. As a high school student, it probably took you a little over 10 seconds to size up your teacher, whether you're going to like them or not. And also, on a more serious note, 10 seconds represents the amount of time an employer is going to give you a resume before deciding whether to pass it on or keep reading. So let's just put this into context because it really is true. If I post a job and receive 100 resumes and spend 5 minutes on each one, I'd be reviewing resumes for over 7 hours for one position. So it's just not going to happen. That's why it's so important for you to make a good impression right away with your resume. Resumes, especially now, are referred to in a lot of ways. They're called your personal calling cards, your self-branding or marketing document, your first meeting with an employer. All these things are very true, but in essence, resumes play a very simple but critical function. The role of the resume is simply to convince an employer that you are worth an interview. So we have found that the most effective resumes usually do convey that message by being as brief as possible without sacrificing crucial information. And anyone can find that balance. It just takes a little bit of practice and perhaps some helpful guidance along the way. And that's what we're here to do tonight. So I want you to come away from this presentation recognizing that effective resumes are ever evolving and changing documents. A good rule of thumb for you to follow is to give your resume a tune-up every 6 months or so you can put your best foot forward in the job hunting process. You just never know when you're going to need it. So why not invest a little time and be ready? Our agenda for this presentation is pretty straightforward and consists of 3 primary objectives. We want to identify key elements that contribute to an effective resume, if I may add, like things that are beyond the obvious. Learn the importance of incorporating appropriate language into your resume. Speak the language of the place that you're marketing yourself to. And then demonstrate using a before and after example of one of your resumes on how to take your resume to the next level, hopefully from good to great. So we'll also be, have plenty of time for questions both during and after the presentation. So don't be shy about asking and, chatting away with Andrea, and we can take it as it comes. So please feel free. No question is a silly question. So let's just jump right in. So a classic mistake that people make on their resumes, and one of the principal things that I want to convey tonight, is using bullets to describe tasks that they should have performed rather than accomplishments or results that they've achieved. So again, let's go back and think about what the ultimate role of a resume is. It's to get you an interview. And one of the most compelling ways to do that is to differentiate yourself from other candidates. Highlighting tasks that you perform does little to distinguish you from other people and set you apart in a positive light. And that'll become clear as we go along tonight. So the bullets above all come from resumes that you've submitted. And they're not terrible by any means, but the bar, particularly in this market, is higher than ever before. And as we go through tonight, you'll see that these do little to distinguish you from the crowd. So the good news, though, is that with a little thought, you can almost always evolve your tasks into new accomplishments. And that's really what we want to do tonight. You want to evolve and restate what you do on your job and to have a results-focused orientation. The key is to highlight your effectiveness in the context in which you perform at work. And these questions will help you do just that. So just take a moment to look at these questions and think about your own resume. Do the majority of your entries answer one or hopefully more of these questions? If not, you may want to rework some of them. So let's go back for a moment, if I can actually handle this, to the previous slide and apply some of these questions so we can evolve our tasks into accomplishments. So, I'd like to speak to you all out there for a second and ask, let's take a look at that very first bullet that involves education. And I'd love for you to pipe up via chat and take a second, again, reflecting on the questions that we just showed and asking whether anyone can make the education bullet more compelling. What would you want to put in this bullet or know about this person to differentiate themselves from others? So again, to put this into context, think about someone who's taught the same subject at 2 or 3 different schools to the same group of students. What kind of language could they use to help distinguish themselves and set forth their accomplishments? Does anybody out there want to venture a guess via chat? I'll wait a brief moment. Okay, so one of the things that we could do to take a look at this is, for this particular bullet, there's probably a lot of things that we could do. One way to frame this in terms of accomplishments would be to think about, as a teacher, did you take your class from a certain level of achievement to a higher level of achievement? So this could be reframed in a different way in terms of, people's achievement levels went up by X. You might be teaching special needs students, which present a different types of challenge, or describe the kind of class that you're working with. You could add numbers that include things like, the number of students that you actually taught, to give the reader a sense of, are you working with 5 classes or 6 classes, whatever it happens to be. You don't want to have a resume in this context which talks, perhaps, again, for multiple jobs, that, you designed lesson plans and taught the particular class, because that gets redundant and, again, focuses a little bit more on the tasks. So we really want to talk about your accomplishments in that sense. Now, if you look again here, the second bullet had to do with product strategy and development. And so there's probably a good way to kind of reframe some of these things a little bit. So let's take a look and see one example of that. So with just a few tweaks, we've changed the entire tenor of this particular bullet about product strategy and development. So this sends a whole bunch of different messages. That, maybe I've really helped my company by increasing sales. That's the pretty obvious one. I'm efficient and I beat a deadline because I got this to market with 6 months in advance. And it also shows that I'm an effective manager. So in one bullet, you conveyed 3 types of messages. Now, some fields are harder to articulate in this way, and I fully recognize that. But I do also want to point things out that even in qualitative fields, you can find a way to talk about your accomplishments and give context to the work that you do. So the last bullet actually has to do with the Hiatt Career Center, and it's kudos to our staff. But in essence, and this is completely true, we've doubled the amount of appointments we've seen in the last couple of years, while increasing student satisfaction with our office at the same time. So even though we're a counseling shop, and they can be very qualitative interactions, there are ways to measure things quantitatively as well. So hopefully that makes sense to people. And as I mentioned before, we've talked a lot about context, we've talked about accomplishments, but another area where we often fall short is failing to speak the language in the industry to which we are applying. And this applies to everybody. And if you can't speak that language, you might be perceived as uninformed, unprofessional, or perhaps both. So it's important it's an important point that will be made more obvious by the resume that we review, which again is from a real Brandeis alum applying for positions. This particular person, which in the resume I'm about to show, is someone who's applying for a position within library science. So there's particular jargon and language that makes sense for that audience. So I'm going to pull that up, and hopefully you'll see that all on my screen. So I think the first thing that I'd like to do, and Andrea is going to probably do a quick poll, is to get your sense of what you think about this resume overall, and then I'll make some comments. And remember, the whole point is to give feedback to people for our audience so we can make our materials even better. So there's a couple of things.
And Joe, I have to say, Julia has the best question yet. What is the job that Stu's applying for? She gets a gold star.
That is a gold star. The job that this person would be applying for would be something in the realm of library science. So while Andrea goes through the poll, and again, this will be good to see your different perceptions on things. So there's a couple of comments I'm going to make, some of which you may agree with, others that you may not agree with, and then some more substantive things that I think are just, that are borderline errors that you might want to point out. And I totally get, we'll circulate these documents later on, that you might have a different view once you have a chance to look at them for a longer period of time. And once again, thanks to the alum who submitted this, this is a real resume. So a couple of different things. So this person has been out of school or out of their undergraduate education for 11 years. In that case, it probably doesn't make sense to have your education first. In many ways, when people look at resumes, it's what have you done for me lately? And part, again, framing in terms of, are you a leader? Have you accomplished things? Are you using the appropriate language and being professional for that particular field? Listing your education first is probably not appropriate for someone who's 11 years out. Now, if you went back and got a master's last year, you kind of clean the slate that way, and it's appropriate to put your education back up front again. But this kind of conveys this message of, if I'm bleeding on my education, that might be perceived as more relevant, or I don't perceive my experience as being as relevant. So as a general guide and a rule of thumb, for someone who's been out for some time, you would have your work experience, then followed by your education, and then maybe some community or professional activities if you want to do that. All right? So that's one point. Another thing, and again, these are real resumes, and we understand that this happens all the time. There are typos on this resume. So right here, you'll see that there's a small r, and on first glance, these are really hard things to notice. You'll also notice, again, this isn't quote-unquote wrong, but you might have a different sense of it when we get to the next resume, is that it's not as balanced as it could be, literally in terms of content. So the entire right side has a lot of white space, and there's a lot of ways to correct that. You can move the dates over. You can move the locations over. Not the end of the world, but it's something to consider. Also, what is atypical in this resume, and again, notice the language I'm using, not necessarily wrong, is that it's somewhat atypical to be bolding and highlighting your degrees as opposed to where you went to school. Now, I'm sure this person wants to convey the fact that they want to highlight the fact that they have a master's in science, library science, there are degrees at Brandeis, but at the same time, if your resume is structured properly, the words should speak for themselves. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. If I'm going to go down to the bottom for a moment, and then before we come back to the meat of CNN, which is a great place to work. So if I look at member organizations for a moment, nothing in particular stands out to me here. Now, after speaking to this person, and we'll see in the next version, they're underselling themselves. They are a member of many of these organizations, and these are great organizations to be involved in if, again, you want to be in library science, particularly what this person does. So for people in the know, these are important organizations. But she has a role in one of these organizations that goes beyond being a member. That needs to be highlighted more than only came out in our conversations. Also, another thing that I wanted to point out is sometimes, less is more. Look at all these great computer skills, but someone at this level doesn't need to say things like their experience with Macs and PCs. That's not why they're going to be hired. They're not going to be hired because they write down that they can do internet research and database entry. That's not what someone 11 years out looking for a higher level promotion is going to be hired for. And once we get to the meat of this, you'll also notice that it's obvious that they're really good at these things, so you don't need to highlight that kind of stuff.
And Joe, I'm going to jump in really quick. You also have a comment through the question box from Jill, so Jill gets a gold star as well. She also talks about the resume needing to be formatted with more white space and really direct and to the point so it's easier to skim through quickly. I think going back to your earlier comment about having the sort of 10-second rule to be able to really see things quickly and get important information right away.
Great. Well, thanks for pointing that out, Jill. And others might feel the same. Another point, again, and we're intentionally being nitty-gritty on purpose. To Jill's point, is this person's stars are not really professional in terms of bullets. Whereas actual professional formatting, you would actually use a bullet. That's just a little bit more appropriate. Another area that we could think about looking at, which we did after talking, is the fact that this person has a bunch of library internships. I would dare say that, again, we want to think of a resume as an evolving, living document. Early in her career, these were probably much more appropriate to have on her resume. As time has gone on and you have 6 years of experience in one place and 3 or 4 years of experience in another, the fact that you have an internship 8, 9, 10 years ago in the same field, so you're not really trying to show something different, probably isn't as relevant. And I only say that. I say that for 2 reasons, because one, to Jill's point, you want to pack a powerful punch. You want to make a really quick impression and one that's really powerful on people. And also, you're taking up space. You're taking up space that can be better utilized in another way. And then finally, a couple of very specific entries. This person's position at the AFL-CIO. I don't know if it makes sense or if it's adequately conveyed. Again, going back to context and accomplishments, they managed a library of over 500 prints and 50 CDs. In our conversations, it came out that that was actually a relatively substantial job. It's because of the context, what was used for. None of that comes across here. It could be her third bullet under that entry could be perceived, although it's not correct, could be perceived as data entry, which is not the message that you want to send. And then when we get to her most recent experience, there's a couple of entries here. For me, again, there is lingo that you need to use and language that you want to use for a particular profession. But at the same time, you also want to make your work clear, your words clear to the everyday reader. When I look at some of these bullets, I find them difficult to understand exactly what she did or what the importance of them was. Or I find myself saying, I want to know more. Or I find myself thinking, wow, that bullet's really great, and then it's undermined by some other information that's added. So to that last point, let's take a look at the second bullet.
And Joe, I'm just going to jump in really quickly because we've got a couple of questions coming in. Faye has an excellent question. She asks, is it necessary to have the day in the date? Because in the example you're showing under AFL-CIO, there's actually the day of the week, October 1st, 2002 that the person starts, yet the date in CNN is month/year.
Well, that's a great catch. It's another formatting catch. So the short answer is no, you don't have the dates. That's actually borderline, wrong. It's very atypical to see an actual date on a resume. It's also incorrect for another reason because of the inconsistency that Andrea just pointed out. Some of these things in terms of formatting, it really doesn't matter at times what you do, but the fact that the two entries are inconsistent might be perceived by the reader of your resume that you were sloppy when that isn't in fact true. So it's a great question.
And I have one more, Joe. Michael asks regarding bullets, that he's been told to avoid bullets because when you upload your resume to an application site, real bullets could be misformatted when it gets uploaded.
They can be, and that's a good point, but you can always convert your resume to a PDF document, which would prevent that from happening. And also there are, again, this goes back to knowing industry norms. You don't want to make monolithic blanket statements, but there are some professions where bullets are the norm, and others where narrative is the norm, and others where it really doesn't matter. So for this, it doesn't matter so much what you pick, but for example, for many, again, I don't want to make blanket statements, for many business professions, it would not be appropriate to use a narrative form. It would be much more appropriate to use bullets. And in that case, I would just simply convert my document to a PDF. But that's a very good question. Are there others, or do you want me to continue?
You covered everything that's been asked thus far.
Okay, so great. So getting back to the second bullet on this particular resume, so manage the DC Library Intranet page for CNN. It's a pretty huge undertaking. Look at the last part of the bullet. Uploaded electronic resources to intranet. That's not really an important task for a person of this level, so they don't need this type of information. When we go back again to our questions that we were thinking about, you know, how to quantify things, what are my accomplishments, you know, what purpose, what objective was I trying to achieve by doing this particular task, sometimes that's not really obvious. It'll be more obvious when we go through. So when I look at this first bullet here, I get a sense of it's kind of important stuff, but I don't know really what she means. And I'd really love to know what type of research that she does. And I'd really like to know, how many people are we talking about here? I mean, is she working for one CNN correspondent, or are there, you know, 5, 10, 50, 100? I mean, she's the news reference librarian for CNN. I really want to know. For, you know, and again, this applies no matter what level you're at. We've targeted this as an alumni webinar, but I think a good example might come from the student world. We have students who run student clubs with a budget of $500, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's also, if you're the assistant treasurer at Brandeis, your budget is about $1 million, and that's a point of distinction that you clearly want to make. All right, so here's the resume. I'll give you one last look. For now, we can jump back and forth. So this is resume number 1. We pointed out some formatting things. Again, you are all smart Brandeis graduates. Your resumes aren't going to be terrible. I'm not trying to imply that this is terrible. What I'm trying to imply is that if I'm going to look at your resume for 10 seconds before deciding whether to read it or not, have you captured my attention? So I'm going to close out of this document.
And Joe, I have a few other questions for you that have come in.
Sure.
We have a question from Michelle. She asks, if I have a few jobs that are relevant to my career path and a few short jobs that are not, is it better to have them on my resume, or should I leave them off and have a time gap on my resume? And Sam also follows up with a very similar question.
So that would involve a larger conversation. So Andy, jump in here too, and I'd love to speak to both of you offline. I'm not a big believer in time gaps. You should not, I don't think, if you had a short stint at a place that can be explained, I think that's better than having a gap. It's very easy to structure a resume in a sense that you might have a section that's called relevant experience or experience, and then where you list things that are appropriate for the position that you're about to target. And you can have another section called additional experience, where you list some of those shorter term places, stints of employment. But again, when people look closely at the dates, they'll see that there are no gaps. Andrea, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think particularly once you've been out for multiple years, you don't want to raise the question of the gap component, but by having a very targeted title, for example, with this resume, it could be, library science experience, for example, and additional experience. You can just keep the descriptions of those things that were less relevant very tiny. I'm also not, there's also a depends on how much of a gap are we talking about? Are we talking about a few months? Or are we talking about a few years? Would also kind of mitigate my answer to that question.
And that's a great point, particularly in this economy. People are very understanding, and quite honestly, if you had to leave your job or were let go, or there were cutbacks and were employed with a relatively short gap, people are very understanding and respectful of that. But as a general rule, the relevant and additional is a great way to go.
Absolutely, and there's a similar question that Michael poses as well. What do you think about dropping older jobs from the resume, particularly for an older employee who's trying to make that time frame less obvious?
This will be interesting. You get to see how we're not scripted on this. Let's put this into context again. So I have been working for 25-something years. My resume is still 2 pages or less. It's a page and a half or so. So I do chop things off my resume as time goes on. And this goes back to my comment about your resume being an evolving, kind of like breathing document. And I don't believe that you have to list everything under the kitchen sink in order for you to have an effective resume. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think certainly it's a valid concern to be concerned about or being worried about how old you're perceived as on your resume. But I really think, and you certainly don't need to have older pieces on it. They could always ask you about additional work history. But I think the other piece that you can do to mitigate that, if you're concerned that an employer is going to be looking at your resume and concerned about your age and that you're older, etc., I think one of the things that you can address right away is the potential concerns they have with that. So an employer might be concerned, for example, that an older employee is less familiar with technology that's currently used in the field or out of date, less up to date. And I think by the use of appropriate language for the field in your resume, you can show that you're up to date. You certainly can do that in your cover letter as well. And by talking about and including a skills section that demonstrates that you're most familiar with the technology of the field is another way that even if they figure out how old you are based on when you graduated from graduate school or undergraduate, that you're still addressing their potential concern around being up to date in the field and being able to be a strong contributor to their team.
I think those are excellent points. Do we have more questions?
That's it for the moment.
Okay, great. So let's say goodbye to this for a second, and we'll take a look at the same resume reformatted, and it'll be interesting to see how you all feel about it. So we'll just close this out and open up the new version of this.
And Joe, Julia is asking, as she saw the revised version, is the question, is an executive summary necessary?
It's not necessary. There are very few things that are absolutely necessary on a document or mandatory. I would say, especially the more seasoned that you are, an executive summary or a profile that can answer the question, why should we hire you, is really relevant and helps highlight your experience. And also, if you can crystallize those thoughts in a way that's compelling, you're basically answering the first question on the interview, tell me about yourself. But no, it's not mandatory. But hopefully what you do see is this is a little bit more of an attention grabber. If done correctly, if you have an executive summary that is just full of platitudes that says you're a hard worker or that you want to work in an entrepreneurial, fast-paced environment that doesn't provide context, once again that word, about your particular experience, then it could not be helpful. So let's stay with this for a second. I like that. That's a good launching point. So basically, when I was talking to this alum, and we were talking about, in essence, why should somebody hire you? Like, what are you looking to do? Like, what are you really good at? And the answer came down to these three things. It was, you know what? I'm really good at research. I can really do that well. And I've done that in a very large, fast-paced environment where a lot was on the line, and I succeeded. This person also has a demonstrated record of achievement in terms of training, and we'll talk more about that, and both one-on-one training and group training. And this person has also worked with diverse constituents, from individual people to middle management to her peers to external organizations. And that ability to have that kind of gravitas and to be externally and internally facing is really coveted in today's marketplace. And these are, as we were talking, these kind of crystallized into her big themes that she wanted to convey to somebody. So that's how we got to this particular point. So in terms of format, just quickly, we don't have to spend a ton of time on this, but I did want to point out a couple of things to you. Notice we do have the executive summary, of course. At the same time, again, not wrong, but we did, in terms of balance, want to put the date and the location of where she worked to the right to give, eliminate some of that white space that I believe Jill had mentioned on the cast. And also, we took a lot of those older internships out. They're completely gone. Because in my opinion, and after speaking to this person, things, again, that are internships from 8 or 9 or 10 years ago weren't as relevant. Now, I talked about earlier the fact that she had a lot of research skills that were all jumbled into one pile. If I'm going to look at your resume and you're going to pass my 10-second test, I want to know what you can do pretty quickly. So by breaking this up, into research, computer skills, and web design, I know pretty quickly what this person can do that's relevant to her profession. You might have the same sort of skills section that involves languages or other types of skills, but these are hard skills that can really help an employer. Also, as we scroll back up, I just made the decision, and again, people would differ on this, to highlight the university as opposed to the degree, because that's just more typical and is not as jarring, at least to my eye. That's not as relevant. What is relevant to me is when I look at her professional, memberships. Again, if we go back, to the old resume, we can see how this is really varied, as are her computer skills. And in the new version, after speaking to her for a while, we come to learn that she does have a leadership position. And if you're in the know in DC in library science, this is a very reputable place that you would want to highlight, that you've been involved and engaged in a network in your particular community. So the fact that she's a member, we still want to highlight down here and want to make sure that no one thinks we're stretching the truth in any way. So we just want to be very clear about what her role was. But here, she coordinates a committee that basically helps in terms of networking and professional development, an area that she's interested in. For the AFL-CIO, again, it was a while ago, so we decided to eliminate the 3 bullets and go with 1. And the 1 is an important one. That was on her other resume, but now we've, talked about this in terms of a goal that she met and the fact of the skill that she acquired. And we put some numbers behind it. So she had a job of going out for the AFL-CIO and having to go research who would be reputable photographers that she could call upon and make a database and make a judgment call on who she was going to use for print and web publications. It wasn't 1 or 5, it was 100. So that was something that we thought was important and that we wanted to highlight. Very different, again, from what we saw in her old entry, which was we just didn't feel was as powerful or as relevant at this point in her career. Again, same experience. This is after just an hour or two of conversations and a little bit of back and forth. Then obviously the highlight here is her CNN experience. So those questions I had early about, gee, what kind of research did she do? And she does some really targeted, sophisticated stuff for over 500 bureau members and correspondents. So she is the go-to person in a lot of ways. Her earlier bullet didn't convey that. And when you are job searching, if you again want to show your competitive advantage and differentiate yourself from other people, that's certainly something that you want to do. Also, some other bullets. Again, we can circulate these documents. If you look down here, she had mentioned before that she had done some training. So she was selected by the deputy bureau manager from all other employees to plan social and volunteer activities. Again, she wants to get into training. She needs to be in a job that's externally facing, or she can deal with multiple people. So the fact that she can highlight this is great. The fact that she was the person selected is a really great thing. When we look up again at a couple of different areas, we see that she developed a training that the deputy bureau manager then made a requirement for everyone. So the type of work that she's doing, even though she's not, saying this explicitly, is basically, I do really good work. That's the message that gets conveyed. I'm selected to take on bigger projects. I've created programs and trainings that have been adopted as mandatory requirements where I work. So we're getting a very different picture of this person that backs up the bullets that we put up here. And then another bullet that I did want to point out is, she oversees the management of the entire intranet for CNN's DC Bureau. And that one, again, it wasn't adequately conveyed. When we first started talking, her point was, well, yeah, I managed it, and I had to kind of, unpack what she was getting at until we came to the point where, oh, you oversee the whole thing, and this is incredibly relevant and important for the type of work that you want to do. So when we take a look again at the particular resume and the way that we've reformatted, the way we've redone it, I think it looks clear. I think it conveys her sense of accomplishment better. There's certainly more context here. The typos are gone, the inconsistencies are gone, and more importantly, it backs up that executive summary in a very concrete way. And if we had talked about before, again, do you have to have an executive summary? No. But if you do have one, and you do have one that is able to convey, like, why should we hire you, or put your best foot forward, this could be incredibly helpful. Do we have questions about this resume?
At the moment, you're all clear.
Okay, so just want to scroll through and let people see it. And if not, I'm going to close out of this one, and then we'll continue. These are things that we don't have to highlight too much. There are some resumes do's and don'ts that are important. We get a lot of questions about how long should my resume be. CVs are a different animal. For those of you who want to know more about that, we're happy to talk about it. Those are more academic in orientation. A 2-page limit, like I said, I've been working for 25, 26, 27 years. You should be able to get all of your information on that. We've looked at before. I don't want to reread this whole list, but I think some of the biggest things that employer that will bite you, come back to bite you, is if you are, exaggerating some details or providing inaccurate information. I know people can want to exaggerate or maybe they're not exaggerating, but the words might come out that way a little bit in terms of their resume, and you just don't want to get far along in a process and then a person feels like that you weren't being fully truthful for them. You also don't really need, especially on a resume, to explain why you were leaving a previous job. Certainly you don't need to do that at all. Again, your resume is, a marketing brand. Get your foot in the door, then explain those things if they do happen to come up. So I think those are important things to point out. This particular audience, I think, would recognize that most of those are important, but don't really feel the need to highlight those very much.
All right, and Joe, I've had a few questions come in. Michelle asks, how important is font and font size?
So it depends on the industry. I would say in terms of, for most industries, there are some traditional fonts. Excuse me. So Times New Roman, Arial, Garamond, Garamond, things like that that stand the test of time. As long as your resume looks professional, that's pretty good. In terms of font, you don't want to go below 10-point font for the most part. It's just really hard to read after that. At the same time, if you've got a page and a quarter of material and you're using 11 or 12-point font for the body of your descriptions, then feel free to go to something like 10, but I wouldn't go below that. Now, there are exceptions to every rule. And that's why you need to know your industry. There are things like graphic design or PR or marketing where you can be a little bit more creative with your format. And then there are industries on the other side of the spectrum that want a very traditional format. And if you don't use that, they perceive that as you not understanding what that profession's about.
Okay, Joe, and Naomi has a question as well, particularly related to the experience section. She would like to know if there's a standard for past or present tense.
Well, the standard, and so please anyone jump in if I'm not answering this correctly, is for a job you're currently at should certainly be in the present tense. Within that particular job, there might be something that you have done in the past and you are no longer doing it. It's okay to leave, to put that in the past tense. It's okay also to leave it in the present tense, as long as when you're on the interview, you're explaining that's a project that you completed and you're no longer working on. What is problematic is really inconsistencies when you're putting things from other older experiences in the present tense or just being inconsistent overall. I don't know if there's a follow-up because I don't know if I'm answering that question fully.
Yeah, I think you are, Joe. The other piece is the kind of every once in a while exception, I would say, to that about a present tense job, certainly in present tense. But sometimes you've won an award. That is fine if you are indicating that in the description that you won an award in 2007, for example. That's okay for that piece to be in past tense.
That's a great point, and the same goes with like if you've been published in the past, but it hasn't risen to the level of you having a publication section of your resume. That would be another example.
And Carrie has a follow-up question as well. You had mentioned in your slide, in your resume, it's not appropriate to share salary requirements. She asks, what if a job asks for salary requirements? Should you ignore it? And what about previous salaries?
So there's two answers to that. In a resume, it's really not appropriate and would be, we see literally thousands of resumes at the Hiatt Career Center, and salary requirements are usually not part of those and would be perceived as being inappropriate. That doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of employers that don't ask you what your salary requirements are. I would do my best to avoid answering that question. I would say things like you're prepared to accept a salary that's competitive for its field, and that if you're a strong candidate, they'll usually bring you in. Quite frankly, some places do have very strict budgetary requirements, And they will ask you on the phone, you know, if they work within a range within HR, look, you look like a strong candidate, but I don't want to bring you in if we can't afford you. In that case, even though this is a resume, you know, workshop, it's really important for you to have done some research on your industry to make sure that you are working within a range that is appropriate, or asking for a range of salary that's appropriate for the particular work that you want to do. And there are lots of great salary calculators out there. I wouldn't use one in particular because you have to make sure that the data set is large enough. But there are lots of ways, either by, you know, looking at geography, talking to colleagues, people who might be in similar positions but aren't in a position to hire. They might be comfortable giving you a range so you can do that research and then walk in with confidence, because the salary negotiation question is going to come up anyway. It's just not typically seen on a resume. Andrea, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I would agree. I think that research piece of knowing what is appropriate is really critical, because you'll know if the salary is fair. And I think that's oftentimes the bottom line for someone is the organization that's offering the salary acting in an appropriate ethical way? And also the other thing that's worth thinking about is knowing what your bottom line is. If you are not going to accept a salary below a certain amount, and that's a fixed point for you, then you know that if an employer comes forward with a salary below that's not going to be appropriate for you, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think that is a great point, and that's a topic. We could have a whole seminar on that alone. And for some people, you know, if part of it is to accept a lower salary to get back in the game, and then transitioning to another job later on, you know, that's a personal decision you have to make. But you're right. If you need to make X, and your research indicates that this company won't offer X, then it really doesn't help either one of you to move forward in the process.
Absolutely, and Martha sends another follow-up question as well, that if the organization requires it, so there's sort of no way to get around it, is it appropriate to add it to your cover letter? And I'll jump in some ways and echo, Joe, what you've already said, is that if you have no choice, you certainly could add it to your cover letter. If it were to go anywhere, it would be there. But since the power dynamic of a job searcher, your PowerPoint increases the more the organization wants you as an employee. I too would echo I'd rather in the cover letter say, you know, appropriate salary, or, best have maybe a range of salary depending on requirements or depending on the expectations of the position, etc., rather than give it a fixed point, because you wouldn't want the employer to obsess about the fixed point that you've given them.
I agree, and I love your point about the power paradigm. As you become a more viable candidate and more attractive to people, that does start to shift a little bit, especially, because hiring the right people is the most important part of any, organization's function. And so I think that it's a really good way to approach it. If you're forced, yes. I find that very rare, though, and I would put it in the cover letter to Andrew's point. But for the most part, I don't think if you pushed back politely and said you're willing to talk, accept something that's commensurate with the field or competitive for the field, I think they definitely want to continue engaging in the conversation. Okay, so I'm going to continue on. Just want to give you some highlights, some things that you may want to think about. And again, we can circulate this after the presentation today. So
Joe, I'm going to quickly jump in with the poll question about what are resources that folks are already aware of.
Okay. Should I back off this slide?
No, that's okay. I've sent the poll out there. It looks like as people are responding, folks are extremely aware of LinkedIn so far. That's 100%. About half of the respondents so far, maybe slightly more than that, are familiar at least with the language of bConnect and bDirectory. Only 27% are familiar with bHired, and only 13% are familiar with Optimal Resume. So I'll go ahead and close that poll.
Okay, so and again, we will circulate these slides. Be Hired is the name essentially of our job database, and there are lots of great opportunities here. It is one of many resources that you can avail yourself of, but there are jobs for alums, and people sometimes forget that. So in addition to looking at other job boards and networking with people and doing your usual job search, we just encourage you to use our resources, the thousands of job postings at your disposal as well. LinkedIn, I'm just going to take a little bit of a guess. I get that people are very aware of that. I also want them to be aware that this particular group, the Brandeis Hiatt Career Center networking group, we have 2,000 plus people who specifically want to help each other, student to alumni, alumni to alumni, help them with their career development, ask these informational questions, seek career advice, like the resume, like the salary question. It's a really great way to meet people who have already agreed to talk to you about your career concerns. So it's pretty, as an alum, you can just automatically enter into Be Hired, into our networking group by requesting. If you go to LinkedIn and look up this particular group, which is easy to do, you can request membership. We'll just verify that you're an alum and we'll allow you in. It's just a wonderful tool. And then BConnect is, I would encourage you to go to the Alumni Association page. There's an entire directory of, Brandeis' 30,000 alumni there as well. And you can do some relatively sophisticated searches to look up people who are in professions or doing, they're doing like-minded things. So there's a whole other universe that you can look at as well to help you with your networking and your job searches. So we did want to make you aware of these things. There's lots of resources at your disposal, both through Hiatt, through the Alumni Association, the Brandeis community, and other networks that you have. Are there any questions at all that relate to these resources or any other aspect of the presentation?
Joe, as folks are putting in their questions, because at the moment there's no question queue, I do also want to follow up on Optimal Resume. Optimal Resume, I know a lot of folks, both alumni and students, struggle with some of the technicalities and quirks of Microsoft Word and other text-based systems to get the formatting right and to shift their resume and see what it looks like in different formats. Optimal Resume has a really extensive set of sample resumes that are explicit for different fields. So if you wanted to get an idea of how an advertising resume might look different than, for example, theater or performance resume, Optimal Resume has a really nice set that you can look at and compare to each other. It essentially allows you to enter your information in like a database, and then you can change the format of your resume or change your fonts or your font size really with a couple clicks to see how your resume would appear as a different format. So it's a free tool for alumni to use, and it's certainly, as you're thinking about what's the best format for you or what are subject headers you might use. We have specific Brandeis examples for alumni, and Optimal itself also has examples explicit by field.
And so after thank you, Andy, that's a great point. And after the presentation, within the next day or two, we will be sending out an email with some links, but you can certainly go to these resources right from our page. Today it's pretty intuitive, but we certainly will be sending them out as well. Do we have any other questions that folks have?
In a moment, I'll send out that web address that you were just referencing to Hiatt's website and Optimal Resume, but at the moment, that's the only outstanding question I have, and I'll go grab that address and email it out to the group.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank you all for your time today, and please, be aware that we're very committed to serving our alumni in terms of your career services. We're going to be making some even more robust changes in the near future in terms of increasing the power of our website and portal and tools for you all. And just please stay tuned both to Louis News and Hiatt announcements for new events or webinars or other series or tools that we're introducing for alumni. So thank you so much for attending. We appreciate it, and have a great evening.